When I first arrived at Ben Het, there was an A team, which is normally 12 men. We also had about 400 mountaineers, and these were the famous, fierce fighting mountain tribesmen from the Central Highlands of Vietnam.
Lieutenant Mike Linnane is a member of Special Forces Team A244 stationed at Ben Het. His team, the Montagnard Patrols, and a 175mm artillery battery are stationed at the camp. They are all focused on one result.
The mission of the Ben Het camp was to attack and destroy North Vietnamese Army units that came into our area of operation. I never met a Green Beret who regretted being there or regretted going there. I mean, being Special Forces means you want to be where the action is, and at that time in Vietnam in II Corps, Ben Het was where the action was.
Ben Het sits on a ridge just 7 miles from the borders of Cambodia and Laos in the Central Highlands of Vietnam. The North Vietnamese Army, or NVA, travels down the Ho Chi Minh Trail west of the Vietnamese border. They enter South Vietnam with supplies and troops at multiple infiltration points. Ben Het occupies a critical position because it overlooks a key infiltration point into South Vietnam.
They wanted to take Ben Het. They wanted it because we were hurting them. We were sitting up on that hill. Every time we saw an NVA move, we put an airstrike on them, and we were hurting them. We were making it difficult for them to infiltrate. We had most of our firepower up in that hill. So if they got us, then the rest of the camp, it was done.
When vehicles reach Ben Het, they are stopped near the airfield by the camp's outer perimeter. That perimeter encircles 2 of the camp's 3 hills. The North Hill is a strong point for the camp. The main hill supports the artillery battery and command bunkers. About 1 kilometer from the main hill, closest to the Cambodian border and the NVA troops, sits the West Hill.
The West Hill was a little bit of an L-shaped hilltop. It was very small. I don't think it was more than 100 meters long. We had a fighting trench. We had a small position where we kept a 106mm recoilless rifle. Also, we had 8 by 8 foot bunkers with, I believe they had 6, maybe 8 rows of sandbags on top of them, and we put a machine gun in each bunker. The point of the hill was what jutted out into the valley. That was the high point of the hill, and that was my observation point. We had all 3 tanks out on that point.
By late February, the men stationed on the West Hill are under constant fire from NVA positions in Cambodia. Mortar rounds and artillery fire pound the camp. Ben Het is under siege.
When we were taking rounds, we were constantly trying to pinpoint where they were coming from. We initiated counter battery fire or counter mortar fire, or our favorite was to call F4s and A1Es. It wasn't like we were running and ducking. We were running to find them and eliminate the threat. When the artillery rounds are coming in, when you're living with it constantly, your ear gets totally tuned into it. Some of them are very easy to hear. Some of the rounds give you a full second or 2 warning, which is enough to hit the deck. Others, like mortar rounds, go to give you a whew, and you better be moving as soon as you hear the first whew.
Dodging artillery and mortar rounds is harrowing, but for the men living at the camp, an even greater danger is imminent.
It is a very basic infantry tactic to soften up an objective with artillery before a ground attack. It was going to get a lot worse before it got a lot better.
It is the beginning of March, and for several nights, the Green Berets have been hearing unusual sounds coming from the jungle.
We heard tank noises west of the camp at night while we were on the West Hill. I made several reports that I was hearing armored or tracked vehicles off in the distance. However, our intelligence folks kept insisting that there were no tanks near us, no NVA tanks at all, that we might be hearing a dozer that they brought in perhaps to improve the road. We had a patrol out up the valley, a kilometer or two. It was led by one of our A-team members, Lieutenant Roy Aslanian. And Roy called me and said he just had some Montagnards come back and that they had definitely seen tanks moving and lining up out in the valley in front of our position.
On the West Hill, speculation has turned into reality. The soldiers defending the hill face enemy armor. NVA infantry and up to 10 PT-76 tanks advance to just 1,000 meters away, directing their firepower at the West Hill.
They came online. I saw them with my starlight scope. I put that scope down and spun on my heels and raced back to my radio to get some artillery going. As I was racing back to my radio, the first round was fired. Sergeant Havermill immediately came racing to me, and he was bleeding profusely in the face and both arms. Fortunately, he had a flak jacket on, and he said that the captain was hurt real bad. The captain had to be medevaced. He could not stay alive. He was bleeding too badly. Well, I knew there was no way to get a dust-off, and we're taking fire from every direction now.
Artillery units from supporting fire bases and mortar units from the main hill unleash their fire into the area of the tanks. There is no air support in the area, so Linnane contacts an AC-47 gunship, known to the soldiers as Spooky. The NVA have a different name for the powerful plane. They call it the Dragon.
We had a Spooky a little earlier that evening, and he had left just moments before the tank attack. Called him and I said, "You got to come back. We have tanks out here." He said, "Tanks?" I said, "Tanks. Tango Alpha November Kilo Sierra." And within a couple of minutes, Spooky called me and he said, "Look, I'm coming back. I'm coming back. I'm going to help you." Spooky began dropping flares for us. So the battlefield was well lit. I could see what was going on.
With the tanks engaged, the Americans must also defend the hill against a possible infantry attack.
The ravine on the north side of us, it wasn't cleared. In a defensive position, you tried to determine the most likely enemy avenues of approach. If I had to attack the West Hill with a ground force, where would I come? And I knew it was up that ravine. I positioned myself in the trench line overlooking that ravine, and I had my Car 15, and I set some hand grenades out in front of me, and I also had put 3 Claymore mines out there. Everything happened. You don't really have a feel for time. You don't know if it's seconds or minutes or a half hour when the fight's going on.
At least 2 NVA PT-76s are disabled, and the West Hill is down 1 U.S. tank crew. But NVA infantry and up to 6 enemy tanks are still out there. With all hell breaking loose, the 2nd Platoon and the medic track make it to the camp. As the battle continues, the NVA weakens and begins to retreat, but the Americans don't let up.
Everybody stayed motivated. Nobody chickened out. And what we did with all of our supporting fire is we created a wall of steel around us. We just created this wall of explosives and steel, and I just didn't believe anybody could penetrate it. And if they did, we were waiting with machine guns.
The Americans have created a wall of steel around the West Hill using heavy airstrikes, armor, and artillery fire. With 2 downed tanks, the NVA lacked the firepower to penetrate the camp's defenses.
We didn't take any fire after that night. It was over, although we didn't know. I mean, they could have been reorganizing themselves for another assault. That would be our tactic.
Just before daylight, with the battle finally over, Linnane calls to the main hill to get aid to his camp.
I told them, we have to have a dust-off up here. We got 2 very seriously wounded Americans, several wounded Montagnards that need to get out of here. I was standing right by the bodies of the 2 dead tankers who we'd laid there and covered with a poncho. And we crawled forward, and the valley had filled with fog during the night, but the fog was lifting. And as we sat there using our binocs to look down the valley, all of a sudden it lifted so you could see the tank hulls out there.
About 1,000 meters away, in the valley below the camp, are the destroyed remnants of 2 NVA PT-76 tanks and at least 1 armored personnel carrier. Debris in the area confirms that other enemy tanks had been hit. 7 bodies of NVA soldiers are eventually located in the perimeter wire around the West Hill, a chilling reminder of how close NVA ground forces had come to the camp.